Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 2, Episode 13, Talking with Kids About Arousal. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. As I was growing up, I interpreted arousal as something that was bad. That if I felt I was sinning, especially if I felt it before I was married, and then it was hard after getting married to suddenly know what arousal was and feel it because I had learned to suppress it and shut it off really quickly with some of these views that I had interpreted as arousal is bad to feel. And as I've thought about raising my kids, I wanted to give them a better picture of arousal. I wanted to help them understand how to feel arousal and understand that it's not bad to feel arousal, but also give them tools of what to do when they feel arousal. And I didn't know how to do that. And so I was so grateful to hear Dr. Leavitt talking about it. And I asked her to come on and share some of her thoughts about talking with our kids about arousal. And she not only gives great examples of how to talk with our kids about arousal, but also how to help them learn great tools so that when they feel arousal, they know how to channel it to stay within their beliefs. Dr. Chelom Leavitt started her career as a lawyer, but after years of practicing, she decided to go back to school to get a degree in marriage, family, and human development. Along the way, she noticed how many couples struggle to feel strong connections in their most intimate relationships. After receiving her PhD from Penn State, she has continued to work on teaching couples about healthy sexuality and researching sexual mindfulness. She is currently an assistant professor at Brigham Young University. Chelom and David Leavitt have been married for 31 years. They have 8 children, ranging from 29 to 4 years old, and 4 granddaughters. I can't believe it's our 1-year anniversary this month of starting the podcast. So to thank you all for being here and learning with me, we're going to be having a giveaway. So look for that this coming week on Instagram at ladies.talkinglove. But without further ado, let's talk love. I'm so excited to have Dr. Leavitt back on with us. Thanks for joining me.
So happy to be here, Ariel.
I'm really excited. We're going to talk about arousal, and especially coming from a lot of religious perspectives, we talk about arousal in different ways in our cultures that sometimes can actually maybe be harmful for our kids, for us, and like suppressing arousal. So I'm just so excited to kind of cover some of these topics. I hope we'll be able to answer some of the questions that may have come up for you all. But let's start off with just talking about what is arousal.
Yeah, so arousal is just this little heightened sense of feeling, a stirring that maybe somebody feels. What's interesting is whenever we talk about arousal, we always couch it in the terms of sexual arousal. And it might be helpful for us to talk to our kids about other kinds of arousal, right? There's intellectual arousal or emotional arousal. And sometimes that's easier for us to understand that we feel arousal in a lot of different areas of our life. And when we understand those types of arousal, it may be easier for us to then identify when we're feeling sexual arousal, right? This heightened sense of feeling or emotion or a physical stirring.
So what's the difference then between arousal and desire, like thinking about sexual desire?
Arousal is actually like a physical response that we're having. We feel physical arousal and we know that from some signs that our body gives us, right? For men, it's very obvious. They have an erection. For women, what we often notice is there's more lubrication, certainly more blood flow for both men and women in the genital region, right? And so desire is something that's more happening in our mind. Now, it's not to say they're not connected, because once we start feeling desire, we do feel arousal often. But desire is something where it's a longing for. We're feeling a need to connect physically, emotionally, all these different ways as well.
And sometimes the arousal, the physiological arousal can happen maybe even before we're recognizing any psychological desire, which I think is so
Absolutely.
fascinating and so
Yes.
important to talk about that. Like,
So
oh,
important.
as a boy might have an erection, but they're not actually thinking about anything sexual, just something in their area. Life happens.
Exactly. Well, and it may just be their body.
Yeah.
It might just be that their body is responding, right? It's hormones. They're just having this ebb and flow of a pattern of hormones. And so that creates some arousal in their body, even though psychologically or mentally they weren't having any thoughts about desire, sexual desire.
Yeah. And for me, I feel like as a woman, my arousal has been harder for me to recognize, probably a lot because of the socialization of my life, but just a little harder. And then when I would notice if an erection happened in my head, it was automatically like, oh, that means sexual desire is happening for that male. Instead of being able to kind of separate those and see that our physiological arousal can happen without necessarily having psychological arousal.
You hit on a really important point. And in fact, there's some good research on this, particularly for women, that women have kind of created because of socialization, most likely. They've created a little disconnect between arousal and their desire, or their physical arousal, and whether or not they actually can recognize that physical desire mentally. So we call that, there's a dissonance between that. There's a little bit of a gap. So what we want to do is close that gap for women and help them be a little more aware of their physical arousal.
Yeah.
Because some women, they'll have them hooked up, however they're measuring arousal, physical arousal, whether it's with blood flow or lubrication or other markers. And so they'll have women hooked up to these, indicators, and they see that there is some type of physical arousal, but mentally the woman is reporting, no, I'm not feeling any arousal. So, and maybe that's even the opposite of what you're talking about, especially for men who feel physical arousal and they're like, hang on, I notice that I'm physically aroused, but I'm not feeling desire necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So those two systems we have to be aware of and then try and understand how we work. Everybody has different patterns.
Yeah. And especially that's made me think a lot with my misconception, especially about like erections and male arousal, is I really want my sons and my daughters to understand that if arousal occurs, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be sexually aroused. Like if something in your physiological world causes arousal, that doesn't, I think sometimes maybe our kids internalize like, oh, if I'm aroused, that means then I'm thinking sexually. And I guess I want sex instead of just like, oh, my body's doing something and I don't need my mind to if it's not already,
Yeah, that's a really important point, especially for adolescents, that they're having this increase in hormones. And so sometimes their body is doing stuff like they themselves don't even know what's going on. And it's important for them to be able to do just what you said, just kind of sit with it and say, wow, this is what my body is doing. I'm just going to notice maybe for a few minutes what the pattern of this physiological arousal is, and then see how long it takes it to kind of diminish without me feeling like, okay, I've got to intensify this or I have to respond to it somehow. I can just sit and be observant, just notice it.
So how do you talk to your kids about that? How do you kind of introduce sitting with arousal?
Yeah, no, I think it's just that simple. I have talked with my kids and other adolescents about just noticing when we have these patterns, sometimes just hormones that are increasing in our body, maybe even triggered by our environment that we're not consciously aware of. We can just sit there with it and say, okay, I am experiencing some physiological arousal. I'm just going to sit here and notice how it maybe increases a little. Then we know this is the pattern for all types of arousal is it increases a little, it kind of plateaus, and then it starts to diminish. That's why I think it's also important to be this frank and detailed in our conversations with our kids about other types of arousal. What happens when you feel angry or jealous or disappointed? Does it stay with you forever? No. Eventually, we notice it kind of subsides, especially if we distract our mind or get involved in some other activity that kind of helps us bring our patterns back to what were kind of those normal levels. The same is true with sexual arousal. We can notice it. We can maybe even distract ourselves, go on a run, or start reading a good book. But then I say distract, but I don't mean for us to just always be distracting. I think we want to notice it, notice those patterns, recognize that it's going to maybe increase a little and then subside. And once we have that confidence that this pattern plays out over and over and over, it's much easier for kids to start understanding themselves and feeling like they're a little more in control of mastering their body, their emotions, their intellect.
So what kind of tools would you give your kids if they're noticing physiological arousal, maybe in a public space or even at home? Do they go to a private space to kind of take a minute and just feel what's going on? How do you kind of walk them through that?
Great question. And yeah, again, I would probably have already set them up so that they have a few skills in mindfulness, in just kind of finding that place, that centered place in themselves. Usually it's with connecting with your breath, right? And so just kind of noticing, breathing in, breathing out. And as we just focus on that, it helps our mind become more connected to our body. And it helps us feel like we have a little more congruence with what we are experiencing. So if we can help our kids previous to this happening to kind of quickly find that place, that centered place where they connect with their breath, and then they can just notice this little pattern of arousal. It will come and it will go in a way that isn't disturbing to our children, right? It doesn't catch them off guard. It's something that they can be prepared for and have a few tools that, okay, when this happens, I remember mom or dad said, just come back to your breath, give it a few minutes. Yeah. And maybe find a place that's quiet. So that's easy for you to do. If you can do it in the midst of people, that's some pretty good skills.
Yeah.
And that would be great if you could do that. But if not, yeah, go sit by yourself for a second and just maybe say, I just need to take a second to, ponder something. And you don't have to tell anybody. You just go off and find a quiet spot for just a few minutes.
And you talked about how it's important to not just distract ourselves, that there might be times where it's like, okay, I recognize this pattern. So how am I going to maybe I can help finish the cycle. I can exercise or do something creative.
Yeah.
But it is important to notice what can happen when we don't take that time to notice and we suppress arousal or like we don't want it. We're just like, no.
Yeah, we're actually teaching ourselves some pretty negative habits if we're just suppressing. What I really think we should do is be curious. Curiosity is really the opposite of judgment. So instead of us saying, "Oh, I'm not supposed to feel this. I want to control it. I want to numb this feeling that I'm experiencing because it's bad," we're giving ourselves all sorts of negative messages about our sexuality. Instead, what we could do is, especially if we've been empowered with some tools, with some knowledge, we could say, oh yeah, this is arousal. My parents talked to me about this, and I recognize that I am feeling physically aroused, and maybe it creates some sexual thoughts in my mind. So what I want to do is just be curious. What is it that maybe prompted this? Was I watching a show that kind of encouraged these feelings? Maybe I was feeling lonely, and so this was my coping mechanism. There could be a whole host of reasons why we notice these patterns occurring. It might just be hormones. It might just be that I'm having this little influx of hormones, and I just need to notice how long it lasts, how it feels, not make any judgment about it, just be a little curious about my body, noticing and becoming a little more familiar with how my body responds to an influx of hormones or a trigger, something that stimulated arousal from my external world. And then as I start to know myself, I have way more skills to be able to sit with it and learn to be a little more disciplined later, in my experience with arousal.
And when you say discipline, do you mean being able to like control the thoughts that come in when you may feel arousal? Or
Yeah. So maybe control the thoughts, control my environment, and then learn to just sit with myself and not feel like I'm compelled to act on this arousal. I can just sit with it and notice it, be silent, be still. That is so hard for people to do. When we're feeling a little arousal, it's hard to just sit and be still. Think of when you're really angry with someone. How hard is it for me to just sit and say, I wonder why I'm angry? I wonder why I'm feeling this sense of rage or this sense of, heightened emotion. If we can learn the skills to do that, we have so much more control over how we respond, right? We're just giving ourselves a little wiggle room, a little space to just notice what we're experiencing. And instead of getting into this habituated response, say, okay, how do I really want to respond?
yeah.
And we do the same with arousal, with sexual arousal. How do I really want to respond? Well, as an adolescent, I want to learn to know myself, but maybe not intensify these feelings.
Oh, that's beautiful. And especially just giving yourself that little bit of space to bring your mind back into it instead of just following the rage or the feelings. I need like a recording of you, Chelom, saying like, why am I feeling angry? Because in my head, it'd be more like, why am I angry?
Well, sometimes my head is that way too. You just reminded me though, we just barely published some really good research on this very point, that adolescents, boys and girls who are more mindful in their own life, are able to sit with this, arousal a little more, but also have so many other positive outcomes. That mindful adolescents are more likely to tell their parents about what it is they're experiencing sexually, right? The thoughts, the feelings, maybe behaviors that they're considering engaging in or have engaged in. And we know that disclosure to parents is such a protective factor in an adolescent's life. This is such a risky time for them. So many pitfalls that they can stumble into without even knowing it. So mindful adolescents are more likely to discuss these things with their parents and get some good guidance. They're also more likely to feel good about themselves and to be more careful about the sexual activities they do engage in. So, teaching our kids to be aware of their own sexual feelings and to be curious about it and to learn to be disciplined about it, be more intentional about it. This is actually a protective factor. Some parents might be tempted to say, oh my goodness, if I say be curious about your sexual arousal, I'm giving them a green light, saying go for it. But in reality, that's not the case. What we're actually doing is giving our kids skills to create a little space to be more intentional.
Yeah. And to be able to choose what they want for their future.
Exactly.
That's so important. And I think without those skills, a lot of us may fall into these kind of two camps on the other side then of suppression or overindulgence, where it's like, I don't feel anything, or it's like, I can't control this because we haven't learned the tools to cope. So what are some things you've maybe seen on the other side of overindulgence that can happen when kids don't have the tools?
When we just tell our kids anything goes, then what we're really doing is setting them up for a whole lot of failure and disappointment, because we know from research that there is no such thing as casual sex. Sex means something to people. It does something to our emotions, right? We have increases of oxytocin during heightened arousal, which creates a bond with whoever we're engaging in those behaviors with. We're actually attaching to them. And so what we notice in research is that girls most often feel a lot of depression and discouragement and betrayal even after they've engaged in more sexual behavior than they really wanted to. They thought they were creating a connection, a relationship with this person, and in reality, they're not, most likely. We have to teach our children to be more intentional about their sexuality. And oftentimes, what that means is they will be able to have more restraint, because what they want is to feel like they belong and like they're having good experiences with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and not necessarily just using their body for arousal at the whim of whoever. That doesn't necessarily give them what they're really looking for.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. Especially, I mean, even in my own dating experiences, there were times where it was like, wow, that person just wanted me to be around to kiss me when it was convenient. And that was such an awful feeling. And instead of being able to know our bodies and know that we want someone who loves us and appreciates us, and it's not just about the arousal. And if we give them these tools, they can, I think that helps them realize that as well, that
Yeah.
people I date, it shouldn't just be about me and my body.
Right. And truthfully, we leave our kids without any good guidance during a time when they really need a lot of guidance. We
Yeah.
kind of have this permissive attitude because we ourselves might feel uncomfortable with sex. So we just say, you know what, you figure it out. That's really unfortunate, because this is a time when kids need some standards, some ethics, some understanding of what you value in sex, right? You can transfer your values to your children by just openly talking about it. Kids are looking for some boundaries, some guidance as they try to navigate through these pretty, sometimes confusing, choppy waters, because they don't understand the nuances of relationships, let alone how their body is changing their own sexuality.
So, how do we kind of take this when maybe we're watching a movie with our kids, or kind of prepare them if they're on their own and they see something in a movie, or they see something in their sphere that kind of arouses them? How do you talk about kind of controlling that environment, or what to do if it comes up, especially in the media? I think about movies right away because I feel like every movie has just such a horrible view of sexuality.
Yeah. Well, you know what that does, if you're watching a movie with your kids and there is a scene that is awkward or that maybe represents values that you don't hold, that's a really great time to just say, let's just pause right here. What do you think about what just happened? And invite them to talk about it. Too often, we're just lecturing our kids. And what we really need to do is just invite a conversation. And they could say, well, I felt like they were showing affection, but maybe they took it further than I would. But I really think it's okay for some people. And you could say, okay, and here's my perspective, and here's the values I hold. And here's why I might encourage you to reserve some of these behaviors, some of these sexual behaviors for after you're in a committed relationship or even married. And then talk about some of these nuanced outcomes that we see from sexuality. We're creating a connection with another person, like it or not. Our bodies do it, whether we intend to or not. So, do we want to create this deeper connection with someone who we know just wants to feel arousal for one night? Is that really what you want? Is that really something that you want to step into? Because you'll likely be disappointed afterward. And I just want you to make more intentional choices in your life so that you feel happy, so that you feel this completion and satisfaction that I think you're looking for, right? I know you a little bit. This is what I think might be some good boundaries for you. What do you think? And then open it to them to consider what you've said and then give some input about it.
Yeah, which is so important. And I shouldn't have said every movie, because not every movie, but I feel like a lot of the media
A
is
lot.
not very great in
Yeah.
especially like relationship realms. It just shows like, oh, we have attractive bodies, let's get together, and it's like, no.
Yeah. And I've even just brought things up at the dinner table. One time I was doing some research. I was writing a paper, I don't remember, and a picture popped up that I completely did not expect, and it was super inappropriate. And so I opened up that conversation by telling my experience and then asking, has that ever happened to you guys? And sure enough, a couple of my kids said, yes, it has. And I felt so ashamed about it. Like maybe I had done something. And so just constantly finding ways for us to talk about what might be going on in their life. I know oftentimes I eavesdrop a little on my kids when their friends are over. And then afterward, we can have a little conversation and I'll say, oh, I noticed that Jordan was saying, this about his girlfriend. What do you think about that? And so there's all sorts of ways for us to bring this up and make sure that our kids know that we are a good source, that we're a comfortable, easy, source that isn't going to condemn them for what they're going through, but instead actually go through this pattern or this exercise of curiosity about what's going on in your life, in your body, in your mind.
Yeah. And wanting to understand. And I think that's so powerful as a parent too, that you were able to show that this happens to me and show them this is what I choose to do, what has worked for you, and to be able to share those thoughts is so powerful.
Yeah. And in fact, I even described to them, I said, I was so flustered that when that popped up, I didn't even know how to click out of it. And then once I kind of had my senses about me, I was searching, for the X to get out of it. And it took me a minute. So understand that if this happens to you, you're not going to be condemned because you don't like immediately know where that X button is. Maybe you pause and stare at it for a minute until you realize, okay, this isn't something I want to be digesting. So let's find the exit button.
Yeah. And that can all be part of a healthy process of deciding what
Absolutely.
you want to take in your life or what you don't,
Yeah.
especially in like religious cultures where we may want to encourage abstinence until marriage. You kind of touched on it a little bit when we were talking about the media, but would you add anything else that you would kind of teach your kids about arousal or giving them tools to those standards or values that are important to you?
Absolutely. Arousal is just a beautiful part. I am religious. And so I believe that this is something that God built into us. So there's a beautiful element to it. However, the more I learn about research, the more I understand why God might ask us to reserve our sexual expression for a committed relationship. That's the place where we're going to create this strong bond, this strong connection with another person. And if we're doing that with all sorts of people before we're in a committed relationship, we're going to be setting ourselves up for, first of all, some disappointment and some real heartache. But also, we know from research that people who have multiple sexual partners before marriage have a harder time creating an attachment within marriage. So, knowing that and then explaining that to my kids helps them understand why they might want to make some choices to create some boundaries around arousal. The other thing we know about arousal is it's pretty powerful. Once we turn on arousal and start intensifying it, it's a cascade of emotions. We have hormones that kick in, our body really takes over, and we have this whole process of intensified arousal until we hit orgasm. Now, so it's pretty hard if we are constantly intensifying that arousal when in our mind we say, oh, I'm going to keep these boundaries, but I'm going to keep bumping up to the line of what I think my boundaries are. What we might find is it's pretty hard for us to do that if we're not developing the skills in lower levels of arousal and kind of creating a little more strength for us to stay away from the line that, might put us over into heightened arousal that leads to orgasm.
And I love talking to our kids about that. So they know, oh, maybe I do want a more committed, connected relationship in my future. So these are some things that I can practice now and practice having healthy relationships instead of just allowing my arousal to keep building in these relationships that I'm doing now, just to kind of talk all about the way they can start creating those healthy relationships now, I think is so powerful.
I do too. You just reminded me of one other study that I'll just mention that looked at couples who engaged in early sex, like within the first month of starting to date, and then couples who had later sex, so maybe a month to 3 months into their relationship, and then those who waited until marriage to have sex. And of those three groups, what we saw was consistently higher levels of communication, satisfaction, sexual satisfaction in the group that waited until marriage. And I ask my students, I ask my kids, why might that be? If I wait to have sex until I'm married or in a committed relationship, why might I have better skills at communicating and feeling connected in my relationship? Why might I see those differences? And ultimately, what we always get to is that if we're not so focused on just the physical arousal, that's our whole relationship, instead, we start to get to know each other as friends. We start to know about your family, about your political views, about your likes and dislikes. We go into all sorts of other areas of our life and create a much more stable relationship that's based on friendship and deep affection, instead of just focusing early on the physical arousal that we might feel like we really are attracted to each other. That's good to know, but that's not going to create a lasting relationship.
Yeah.
Instead, in this early period of your relationship, focus on just your friendship and getting to know each other. And with even younger adolescents, focusing on social skills. Like, how do I just talk with people in a comfortable way? And then as you get older, okay, now as I pair off or as I date, how can I get to know someone at a deeper level and share things about myself that I wouldn't in just a casual conversation, right? So we're just building on skills as they get older.
Yeah.
Instead of rushing it right at the beginning,
Totally.
jumping into the physical.
Yeah. And then they learn too, like, oh, that type of person maybe wasn't a safe person to share myself with because they betrayed what I told them, or, and then they can learn. Because I think that's a huge thing a lot of us miss out on in our sexual relationship, is that, oh, sex isn't good if we're not close. Like, we have to have the friendship and the connection, men and women, the emotional connection to make a good sex life.
Yeah, you're right.
This has been so awesome, Dr. Leavitt. Thanks so much for coming on. Can you kind of just give us a couple tips, especially for parents listening who are like, oh, I haven't talked to my kids about arousal. This is so overwhelming, and maybe I'm embarrassed and feel uncomfortable. What are some tips you would give them to kind of get started and start this conversation with their kids?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, practice with your spouse. This is a good conversation to say, okay, we're going to talk about this with Jane and Jim, but we are really worried about how this will go. Let's practice with each other, kind of troubleshoot questions that we might be embarrassed to ask. That's a really good way, because once we open up that conversation with them, we want it to be comfortable. We want there to be a really warm environment where we're not showing fear on our face, which is hard to do, right?
Yeah.
If you're not feeling comfortable. And the other thing I would say is just slow down. Realize that taking this slowly and telling your kids, I don't know the answer to that. Let me think about that for a day or an hour or whatever, and I'll get back with you, and then get back with them, right? And so let them know that sometimes we have to think about some of the questions that they ask. We don't have all the answers, but we're a really good source to get the answers.
And that creates so much trust on their part that, oh, Mom and Dad will come back and talk to me.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love the benefit of that too, that talking with your spouse beforehand can make it so that you guys are more comfortable talking about sex as well, and with your kids. It's a win-win.
Yeah, you may go back in the bedroom and say, okay, I had no idea how to answer that one. And then brainstorm, okay, what's a good, maybe look up in a trustworthy book. How can we handle this particular topic?
Which Chelom has some great resources. Can you tell us where we can find more of your resources?
Yes, absolutely. On my website, we've tackled a number of topics, and we have a few podcasts you could listen to. And that's just www.chelomleavitt.com. Just my name, Chelom Leavitt.
Awesome. And their podcast is called The Sexual Mindfulness Project.
Yeah, because really what we're trying to do is just help people slow down, be more mindful about these relationships, particularly your sexual relationship.
Thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Ariel. So fun to visit with you.
After hearing this episode, I feel so much more prepared to talk with my kids about arousal. Dr. Leavitt had so many great insights about sitting with arousal and helping teach our kids mindfulness to recognize that arousal isn't bad. It's a good part of life, and we can sit with it and feel it. We don't have to intensify it or squash it down. And we can even use some of that energy to maybe go on a run or have a creative outlet. I loved so many of her tips, and also just the openness to talk with our kids. Oh, what did you think about that part of the movie? How did you feel? I also really appreciated this episode because I think I believed this, and I think probably a lot of us who grew up in religious cultures, especially those that encouraged waiting to have sex until marriage, believed that kind of learning to control our arousal was something that was important before we got married, but after we got married, it wasn't as necessary, or we wouldn't really have to worry about it. But teaching our kids these skills before marriage is so helpful for them after marriage, because learning to channel our arousal in good, healthy ways that bring us closer to our partner and keep us continuing to grow the connection with our partner and allow us to channel our arousal within our beliefs and values is so important in marriage. In fact, it's probably just as important, maybe even more important. There are times where we might feel aroused that our partner is sick or not in the mood or having a hard time, and we just need to cuddle. And so I think these skills are crucial to help our children learn now before they get married, and also learn that these skills will be so helpful for them in marriage later on. I hope that you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Leavitt. I learned so much and hope that I can do a good job as my kids get older. They're still pretty young, but to talk with them openly about arousal. As always, thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.